We are pleased to introduce our next panel discussion entitled Meeting Demand Tomorrow. Abigail Kakura, Director for Future Technology Platforms at the Special Competitive Studies Project, will moderate the discussion. Please welcome our panelists. Brian George, U.S. Federal Lead of Global Energy Market Development at Google. Justin Hotard, Executive Vice President and General Manager of the Data Center and AI Group at Intel. The Honorable Mark Menzies, President and CEO of the United States Energy Association, and Dr. Costa Samaras, Director of the Wilton E. Scott Institute for Energy Innovation at Carnegie Mellon University.
Good morning, everyone. We are honored to have with us today an esteemed group of U.S. energy experts to assess the surge in power demand and lay out the challenges and opportunities associated with our energy build-out in the next 1 to 2 years. We have Brian, who works at Google, Justin at Intel. We have the Honorable Mark Menzies, former Deputy Secretary of Energy. And we have Dr. Costa Samaras, who left his role in the White House in February and is at Carnegie Mellon. So we have a really great mix of policy and private sector experts to really look at what is the solution space for this tech area. So I'd like to start by asking each of you, starting with Brian, what has changed in the past few years? Why do we need to have these discussions about AI and energy today?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks, Abby, for the invite to be here today. It's certainly a timely conversation, and I think it's a great question to start because folks who have been in the power industry for a while know that we have largely been facing flat or declining load growth for the past 30, 40 years. Not only is that not the case anymore, we are facing rapidly growing demand, right? And we're seeing revisions to forecasts on a yearly basis that have significant increases to the prior year. And so I think it's really forced policymakers to be in a situation that they simply haven't been in for a while. And so from my perspective, and this is going to drive a lot of my conversation today, I think that really means that we need to be collaborating across the broader ecosystem to a much greater degree than we have in the past, right? There is an education campaign, frankly, that needs to happen about what we're providing to the system and the needs that we're placing on the system. And so I think just that fundamental shift from a point of flat to no growth to where we are today, that's the biggest thing in my mind in terms of difference.
Justin.
Yeah, I think as you touched on, first of all, the biggest change is AI and the demand for AI. Right? Gen AI, we all know ChatGPT in early 2023 came out, and not only has ChatGPT driven a bunch of demand, but it's unlocked the demand from a number of competitors. And obviously the panel before us, you had one of those innovators with a member of the Anthropic team up here. But it's also changed our view of how compute is going to scale. And if you really look, if you look at the last, say, decade or 2 decades, what we've been writing down is, something that Intel's been well known for is the concept of Moore's law, significant power efficiency. And largely as compute demand has grown, it's been quite predictable because we've been able to make semiconductors and computational chips more and more efficient. What's changing with AI is a potential explosion in compute demand because the amount of data that we're now looking to process, whether we're training models or we're inferencing or serving those models and answering the questions that we have or gaining new insights and solving complex problems we weren't able to solve before. Those computational demands have are actually far higher than they were before. And so now it's not just enough to ride the trajectory of Moore's law and the improvements in semiconductor performance. We actually have to think differently. And we actually have a number of insights from this. And again, if you look at where we've been in supercomputing and high performance computing has had these same vectors of power consumption and power and compute density for many years. Now we're building thousands, hundreds and thousands of supercomputers around the world, and particularly here in the US. And that is what is driving this vector of power consumption. So as we think about what's changed, it's actually requiring, like any good innovation or any good constraint, as Brian talked about, any good constraint, it's driving a different vector of innovation for us, and not just in how we design chips, but how we think about systems, how we think about this full ecosystem. And if you believe the data that's out there, the market for data center construction alone is, the view is that for the foreseeable future, it's going to grow at a 20% CAGR. The demand is probably far in excess of that. That's really driven by the constraints in the supply chain and the time it takes to build data centers, the time it's going to, the available power to actually construct these data centers. And so I think that's a good, a good indicator of the forces and what we need to think differently about power.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to speak from the point of view of sort of being the Washington policy person who's been in this town for over 30 years, trying to always react to what's happening in the private sector and to try to get the policy in place to implement or respond to. And so from my point of view, just over this past time period, I mean, we literally went from in the world where we were trying to address emissions, you saw the studies that came out for us to be able to reduce emissions. We had to electrify our economy, right? We had to look at the electrification of our economy. So policymakers were looking at, okay, how can we electrify, the industrial areas, those that might use internal combustion engines for heat. And so that was what we were trying to figure out how to do. And then you had, the passage of the IRA, which had EVs, the incentives there, and now you had to look to increase electricity demand because more and more people were going to take advantage of the IRA and the move globally to more, electrification of, the transportation sector. So this was suddenly putting, a new demand on the grid. And of course, as our economy was growing coming out of COVID, we began to see an increased demand over, the recent years to do this. And then if that wasn't enough change in the power sector, then you had Sam Altman making an announcement not that long ago, which certainly changed a lot of people's lives in this town when he said, we will be dependent on AI in the next 2 years, and you won't even really know it, but it will happen, and we're going to need such an increase in electricity, we can't meet the load. And he actually threw in, which also had a big change in the way people looked at the source of power, threw in a quip about fusion. Well, really many people's lives changed certainly at that moment. Then the question became, do we have sufficient power in the United States to be able to provide the power to where we're going to be able to provide the data centers necessary for this AI? And then policymakers started realizing, because of the tremendous abilities of what AI can do, was we need AI to help to operate our grid, to be able to operate our grid more efficiently. And we need AI, of course, to bring in new power sources, whether it's in the small modular reactors on nuclear, or of course fusion. So you need AI, or even our current power plants. So suddenly, you see this kind of ironic situation to where, well, we need AI to help us increase our power demand, but we need power, of course, to be able to use AI. So that's sort of where we are today. And you have policymakers now, looking at what do we need. Do we need to do anything? I think and we'll get into it, but I think the answer is yes, and what will that be? So that's sort of what's been happening from our point of view.
Well, I think I'd start with, will the future look like the past? And in some cases we want it to, and in other cases we don't. We heard the Secretary Granholm talk about bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. These are going to double the amount of clean electricity we have on the grid by 2030 and double the emissions reductions that we're going to have by the end of the decade. And that's great. It's also, kicked off a manufacturing boom. And so the load growth that we're talking about here over the next decade, half of it is going to be from electrified transportation, which is good for our lungs, good for the climate. Another 30% is going to be from electrifying our industry and buildings, parts of industry and buildings. And so the remaining overhang, that last 20%, is where data centers come in. And so what I want to say is we've done this before, right? In the 1960s, annual load growth was 7%. In the 1970s, annual load growth was 5%. And then from the 80s until 2005, we did load growth above 2%. And then only in the last decade and a half where we had this flat load growth that we're talking about. So going forward, we need load growth in the 2 to 3%, and maybe more, maybe less. But I got to believe that the United States of America can handle load growth in the 1990s. I think we can do that. And I think we need to be deliberate. We need to be effective. We need to act with purpose. And we need to understand that electrification is going to be good for the United States. And I want us to handle the data center challenge, which I know that we can, because if we can't handle the data center challenge, which is the small part, right? The data centers is 4% of our US electricity demand, maybe going to 9 or 10 or more percent. If you flip over all the cars to electric tomorrow, which it won't, take some time, that adds 25% electric demand. And that's something that is good. So if we can't handle the small stuff, we're not going to be able to handle the big stuff. And so we have to demonstrate that data centers and the demand for AI in the United States that can help grow competitive industries here, that can be good for our national security, that can drive innovation, that we can do this. And I'm very confident that we can.
Thank you so much. This is a great discussion already. I'm going to go in the reverse order now. And Kosta, I'll start with you and ask you to put your former White House hat on and talk about some of the policies that the Biden administration has put in place that you think need to continue or be scaled. What are the areas where we need policy continuity, and what are some new ideas that you hope are injected into the policy conversation?
Well, the grid is our national highway system for the 21st century. Our innovation, our competitive industries, our life safety critical infrastructures relies on the grid. And a lot of the investments that the Biden-Harris administration made in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act enhance and build out and protect the grid from new threats from climate change, new national security threats. So going forward, we have to recognize the grid as one of our national treasures. And I know that the grid, we all know that the grid is not a grid, it's a collection of regional balancing area authorities that all have to talk to each other, and sometimes they don't. And that's the way that we do things here. But we can invest at the national level in really what we need is a grid New Deal. We need to ensure that our transmission and distribution system can handle all the new loads from AI and all the other electrification pieces. And a lot of the cost growth in electricity, retail electricity, has been in the transmission and distribution system. So one of the most interesting and boring things that we should be doing policy-wise is reconductoring our wires, driving more electricity through the same amount of systems, reinvesting at the wires company level on the infrastructure that is going to be more efficient, more resilient, and more responsive. And then also, the Secretary talked about virtual power plants. We need virtual power plants for America. And we can do 50 to 150 gigawatts of new virtual power plants connected to the grid in the next decade and a half. And that is going to help in the near term alleviate some of the stresses that data centers and AI are driving.
Thank you. Mark, turning to you and your time as Deputy Secretary of Energy, how would you lay out a strategy for energy? What are the essential variables the nation needs to get right in the next few years to set us up for the next decade?
It's an excellent question. And this might surprise some people in the room, but, when you get into the executive branch at the federal level, the first thing you sort of realize is unless the Constitution authorizes you to do something or Congress has essentially allowed you to do something or not prohibited you to do something, there's not a lot of federal authorities really to be able to, say, build out our nation's grid. You had mentioned the highway system. Our grid system it's not like the highway system in that it's not funded that way. We don't have a priority of which projects. Now, we do have authorities to be able to, be cheerleaders, to facilitate, to try to work through processes. But the fact of the matter is today through our federalism system, we still, all permitting essentially is at the local level. You have seen FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, though, take an initiative which seeks to address some of the issues that the Secretary had mentioned when she was here about how it is that if you're going to build interstate transmission lines or intrastate transmission lines, you need to figure out essentially the cost allocation of it. And so generally, that's how our transmission system really has been built. So you need local buy-in, you need stakeholder groups, you need, whether it's a municipality or a co-op or investor-owned, a local authority or the state Public Utility Commission. And then FERC has about jurisdiction over about 10%, and that's the transmission's size of it. But without the state's approval, it's almost impossible to get an interstate transmission line built. So you see FERC taking an initiative, using its current authorities to try to facilitate those projects that have addressed the issue of who's paying for the costs, for improvements to the grid. But otherwise, there's still the need to address permitting. And there's a bipartisan bill out there. I'm not advocating for or against it, but just to emphasize the importance of recognizing that you have to get the permitting right so that we can get infrastructure built, in this country. So when we say we, and we're speaking about America can do this, well, of course. America typically can figure things out. But the we in this case depends on if you're a state regulator or you're a local regulator, or you're a consumer group concerned about increased cost and who pays. Suddenly the we becomes, different people.
Let's talk about the technological variables on the table now. Justin, what is one big moonshot tech idea and some low-hanging fruit that we should do to get this right from the CHIPS perspective?
Yeah, I think that let's start with the low-hanging fruit. And we were just talking about the highway system. The highway system is probably a great example because if you've ever been to California as a resident of California, every time we add a lane in the highway, we immediately add congestion. And that's kind of the environment we're in compute infrastructure. Every time we add capacity, it's soon. And that is really a way to think about the low-hanging fruit. There's a ton of technology that we've invested in over the last decade to get our compute infrastructure more efficient. However, we have some really old highways out there. We have a lot of aged technology, aged infrastructure, and for companies that are deploying that aged infrastructure, did I lose my mic? Wondering. There we go. For companies that are thinking ahead, they're already upgrading a lot of an infrastructure. Why? Because it's far more power efficient, and it's not just the compute that's power efficient, but all the associated infrastructure. For example, systems that we're launching today can provide 3x better density than what we've launched in 2019. It's a massive step forward. And it's a huge benefit for compute efficiency because that creates additional capacity that you can then invest in incremental supply, incremental infrastructure capacity. So low-hanging fruit, I think that's the biggest opportunity. Beyond that, there's also innovation that we've now deployed into our compute technology to make it more efficient. So we talked about using AI for the power grid. We're actually, through software, optimizing systems, optimizing power consumption, making sure that we're using less idle cycles. And this is where, whether it's players in public cloud infrastructure, the hyperscalers that are probably very innovative in this, and even innovative enterprises, driving more of that capacity and efficiency, leveraging that advanced technology, leveraging some of the software innovation and system innovation. And then I would say the moonshot vision is one of not just being carbon neutral, but being carbon negative in our data center builds. And this starts with a principle of clean energy, understanding that, and building with very low carbon footprint in the supply chain. Some of the opportunities we have as we reshore a lot of the semiconductor manufacturing, for example, into the United States, through the partnership with the administration around CHIPS and Science Act. There's some great opportunities to do that. But it also continues all the way to how we think about data centers and designing them with the latest technology, with liquid cooling technologies where we're actually using water instead of air conditioning or air handlers to cool our infrastructure, and then reusing that water back so that we can then leverage the wastewater, the heat water for whether it's for thermal capabilities for cooling infrastructure. We see that in places in Europe, for example. Or even there's some innovators that are looking at using it for greenhouses, for being able to grow vegetables, berries year round, and in parts of the country where you're normally not able to do that because of the climate. So there's many things we can do, but we have to take that entire systems and holistic systems approach and leverage a lot of the technology that's current versus continue to rely on some of the aged infrastructure that exists today.
Thank you. Brian, we're starting to see the private sector become a market for energy. How is the power market changing, and what is Google's strategy?
Yeah, so I think, again, this kind of goes back to the point around collaboration and partnership. I think this really is a generational opportunity to transform the system, but we can't do it without all of the partners in the ecosystem, right? That's the tech ecosystem, that's the policy ecosystem, that's the power ecosystem. We've all got to be working together. And so I think it is within the national interest to do that, right? Because as we were talking about earlier, yes, AI is a component of this growth, but it's also things like the reshoring of domestic manufacturing. That is good for the United States of America. We want that to happen, and that growth is an indicator of economic growth. And so those are all things we should be steering in the right direction to achieve. And so from our perspective, I think I want to talk a little bit about what we think we can do from a commercial perspective to help bring resources on to the grid. Just to back up for a second, we have met our total load on an annual basis with 100% renewable electricity since 2017. We largely did that through the development and use of power purchase agreements that we were able to go out and sign deals with wind and solar developers, and collectively, corporate off-takers through the use of those PPA tools have driven 84 gigawatts of carbon-free energy to the grid since 2014. That is a huge number. But we know the PPA isn't going to be enough to get us the resources we need. We know we cannot run the grid on wind and solar alone, and so we have to think about new commercial tools that enable us to really run the grid on a 24/7 basis with firm, dispatchable, clean power. And so from our perspective, there's a couple things that we're doing. The first is we're partnering very closely with our utilities to think about how we can use our capital to bring on resources that may not otherwise get brought onto the grid because they're a little bit more expensive. But these are resources that are clean, right? And so can we use our capital to deploy resources like we did in Nevada for enhanced geothermal in a way that benefits everyone on the system? And so that's a tool that we're hoping to replicate. And I know Tim Latimer from Fervo is in the room, and so I just want to give a huge shout out to the work that we have done with him and his company and NV Energy and the ecosystem in Nevada to really use our capital in a way that can bring the resources onto the grid that we need. And so the second tool, and obviously we want to replicate that, but the second tool is something we have called the Advanced Market Commitment. And what this is a way for us to pool our demand with other large demands, in this case, Microsoft and Nucor Steel, to be able to send a signal to the market that says, hey, this is a collective amount of demand that we can bring to the table to help support the offtake of a new clean, firm resource like advanced nuclear or like an SMR over a long-term period. And so I'm actually really hopeful that we're going to have some more to share on that in the next several weeks. But again, this all comes back to we know we need resources on the grid that we don't have today. And because we are the ones demanding those in addition to our peers, it's on us to come up with the commercial tools in collaboration with our utilities, with the developers, with policymakers to make sure we can do that in a way that doesn't impose unnecessary cost on other customers, but brings clean, firm, reliable power to the grid when we need it the most.
Thank you. I'll turn back to Mark to start here, but would welcome others to jump in after. What is the right mix of energy sources that we need to get this right? What do we need in the short term? And then what should we be doing now for the medium and longer term energy technology?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We view this as you should be striving for net zero emissions typically now. And in the U.S., of course, the only new generation we're building, of course, except for the Vogtle plant that we just finished building with the nukes, with the nuclear, is, it's all renewables or it's natural gas. And so the good news is that has allowed the U.S. to lead the world in actual emission reduction since 2005, because essentially we're replacing coal plants with natural gas. Of course, the Reliability Corporation, NERC, recognizes that, that puts constraints on our natural gas system, right? Because if you're getting 35,000 megawatts now on natural gas and you're limited to pipelines, we were talking about the permitting problems. Again, as difficult as it is to site interstate transmission lines, it's very difficult to site interstate natural gas pipelines these days. So I think that is moving us in the direction where we are. Certainly in the power sector, we're way down the path, to meet goals. Now, the aspirational goal you heard from the secretary, is one where it's all clean. Well, again, I think it's a net zero is what you need to look at, not so much 100% of this or 100% of that. I think binary decisions like that are not helpful at all for us to meet our emission targets and to really have a healthy mix. It's interesting with respect to, siting power in different parts of the country. We should be aware that in the FERC-approved RTO and ISO markets, which primarily in the East and the Midwest and on the West Coast, not all of them send the same price signals that we talk about. Very difficult to get merchant plants built in these bid-based markets. Historically, it's been difficult. It's only in the last few months, the last capacity auction, PJM, that actually sent price signals to the generation side that you could seriously begin to discuss price signals capable of supporting the development of merchant nuclear, if it's small modular, potentially in the future, fusion. But that's the first time that really we've got an indication that in the bid-based markets there's any hope of building something like new nukes. Otherwise, it's natural gas, it's renewables. Nothing wrong with that, but you do have certain restrictions, and it doesn't really send the signals. That's why it's in the Southeast, in the Rocky Mountain states, where you have the Western Energy Imbalance Market. In the Southeast, you have the SEAM model. That's where you can build SMRs or nukes, et cetera, as an example, because then you can really work with your utilities and your regulators that we had made before, and you're not really trying to demonstrate inside a bid-based market to be able to send signals to where you can invest in long-term, very expensive, initially upfront capital to build this, when we know, though, over time, power like nukes can run 40, 80 years, and when you get out that far, it is almost too cheap to meter at that point. So your investment, today makes sense certainly 40 or 80 years down.
Kosta.
So I think in the near term, we can make a huge drive for efficiency and virtual power plants, as I talked about, but then really investing, as the Deputy Secretary was saying, making sure that we can permit, site, and locate clean energy across the country. And really that doesn't start with removing the protections for communities. It starts with enhancing those protections for communities and building up the capacity both in the federal government and the state and local government to do it faster, more efficiently, and with people on the ground involved. And so we need to build the capacity to do permitting right. And then, we should be looking around the country at our near-term options. We saw Microsoft's restarting of the unit at 3 Mile Island that closed just a few years ago because it couldn't compete with low natural gas prices. And so there are other nuclear units around the country that could be restarted. There are nuclear units that could be uprated, basically take a new turbine and put it where the old turbine was. There could be uprating of hydro dams. There could be installation of new hydro on small head hydro. All of this money is in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act to get a bunch of these things done in the near term, as well as advancing enhanced geothermal, as we talked about, in the places that make sense in the near term, building that capability here, inventing it here, building it here, deploying it here. And then finally, those of us who are not in the power business, I don't think really understand the kind of revolution of renewables and storage that's happened over the last 4 years. Storage on the grid was driven mostly by some regulations in a couple of states up until 2020. And now we heard the secretary say, we have Hoover Dam's worth of energy storage batteries going on the United States electricity system. And so we have to reimagine what our possibilities are, reimagine what we think we can and cannot do. And maybe we need to build a couple more Vogels. We have the workforce in place. We have the supply chain in place. Now we should see how that works. And then still advancing our investment in small modular reactors and beyond. So, this is an approach where we lead with inclusive innovation. We're clear-eyed about the barriers, and we use government-enabled, private sector-led initiatives to get over those.
So maybe just to pile on to that, I tend, and to maybe come back to the highway analogy, Congress and the administration, through the IRA and through the bipartisan infrastructure law, provided a lot of cars, but they didn't provide the highways to drive those cars on, right? This gets back to the transmission problem, and we don't have those highways today. And so I think what is very clear for us, at least, is the single biggest constraint to growth on the power grid today is lack of transmission, right? That is prohibiting load growth and load interconnection, but it's also the single biggest barrier to new generation interconnection, right? We've all heard about the generation interconnection queues and how long they are and delayed they are. That is a function of lack of transmission, right? It also gets to the problem of who pays for that transmission. And so we think it's critically important for FERC to play a role in this cost allocation discussion, in this permitting discussion, in this planning discussion, but they must do it in collaboration with state and local partners, right? We're not going to build the infrastructure we need if we simply go out and do it without working with those local entities. And so I think in order to get the infrastructure we need for tomorrow, we've got to get the planning, permitting, and cost allocation tools right today. Now is the time to do that. And so I think there's a lot of momentum. We actually support the Manchin-Barrasso permitting bill on the Hill right now. We think that sends a very strong signal to FERC, and we do think it sends a signal to the states and all other entities to really think about how we can work together to do this. But I want to go back to the prompt of the panel for a second, because it's centered around meeting demand in the next 24 months. What can we do, right? We're not going to solve permitting in a way that actually leads to new steel in the ground, high KV transmission infrastructure in the next 24 months. That's just not going to happen, right? But what we can do, and this gets back to a point Costa made, which is there is a tremendous amount of value that is untapped in the existing transmission system today. I believe DOE did a report that said there's up to 100 gigawatts of capacity that could be unlocked through things like reconductoring, dynamic line ratings, and overall grid-enhancing technologies. There is no reason we should not be making investments in those things today, right? The market is there, the need is there, the capital is there, and so it's not clear why that investment is not happening. From my perspective, it really comes back to misaligned utility incentives for investment and lack of transparency into the system for where third-party developers may be able to come in and provide those solutions. I think there are some real things we can do in the near term to improve that and make these things more attractive for investment by utilities and by third parties, because it doesn't make sense to think about planning the system on a long-term basis if we're not getting the most out of the system we have today. It simply doesn't. So I think that's where we need to focus over the next 24 months.
It's an excellent point. And I'm going to ask Justin to talk a little bit about how the technology itself is going to change over the next 24 months And how can policymakers and regulators craft policies that are going to be adaptable to the way chips will change, compute, AI?
Yeah. So in terms of the next 24 months, I think the reality is our cycle is pretty long, right? In terms of how we invest and build silicon. So the chip designs we have today, started largely 3 or 4 years ago, and probably even earlier than that if you think about original designs. The short term is actually less critical for us. I think we've got a lot of the technology already built to be very efficient. Again, replacing legacy infrastructure with more modern technology, employing some of the advancements that we see that drive lower carbon footprint, whether it's liquid cooling as a great example, or these modern systems with greater energy efficiency, and obviously being thoughtful about it, leveraging renewables in these data center designs. Because the reality is, you heard a great example from Google in terms of the work they're doing with renewables. The reality is not all data centers are run on renewables today, and so there's opportunities in those areas around innovation. I think the more important thing is we need to continue the public and private partnership, particularly around the longer term investments. And a lot of what we have today and the way that we're meeting demand and the way that we're managing this so efficiently, or relatively efficiently and effectively, is because of the long time public and private partnership, particularly with the DOE. And the Department of Energy, the investments they made around the Exascale Compute project, and now the discussions we're having around FAST initiative, which is really around the next generation program for AI research and technology. Not only are they important for scientific advancement, for national competitiveness, for national security, they're as important for pushing the technology forward and making those innovations. And then, of course, on a longer term basis, there's new computing technologies, neuromorphic computing, obviously quantum computing has been discussed a lot. They're less about specifically being more power efficient than their predecessor, but actually getting the right use case for the actual underlying compute technology. And a great example is if we were to envision AI a decade ago, it would have been far less efficient than what we're seeing today. And so the importance of these longer term investments, making those investments today, and sometimes I think we get so caught up in the short term, and particularly we can be, Mark mentioned this in his comments, we can be reactive. This is a place where for the U.S., for long-term national security and for long-term national competitiveness, we need to be really thoughtful and proactive. And I think that's as important for our legislators as we look at the next 12 or 24 months.
I'd like to close with a lightning round. I'm going to ask my industry folks to make a recommendation for government and my policy folks to make a recommendation for the private sector. So we'll start with Brian. What is the single most important thing you'd like to see government do in the next year?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to the collaboration point, right? We know we need to build infrastructure, and we know we can't do it without talking to all levels of government. And so I tend to focus a lot of my time in Northern Virginia, as I expect a lot of us in the industry do. And there is a fairly controversial transmission line that's being built in Loudoun County right now that is being opposed on the local level. And so at the same time, we've got DOE that's looking at designating Northern Virginia as a national interest economic transmission corridor. Those two things are very far apart. We've got to bring the levels of government more closely to a point where they're working more closely together from the local, state, and federal levels in a way that we can build infrastructure that makes sense for those communities where we're building that infrastructure in.
I think I touched on it in my prior comments, but I think continued investment for the next horizon. I think that's as important as we address some of these short-term challenges. Continued investment for the next horizon is going to be critical.
And Mark and Costa, same to you, but what is the single thing you would like to see the private sector do in the next year?
The private sector. So think creatively of working within the current permitting, assuming that we being, in this case, we being Congress, doesn't pass a permitting reform legislation. So we have seen this already. Perhaps we can work creatively with our regulators to create a separate class of customers, for example. We've done that, in the past when we can elevate a sort of national interest to do things. So that could be one way to do that. So if you're data center, and we want to be the global leaders in data centers, we do for security reasons. I think at one time, just maybe a year ago, data centers were believed to be able to be put anywhere in the world and that, we could have access to the cloud. But because of security and competitive reasons now, we need to site these here in the United States for all good reasons. So I think if the private sector can take the lead to know what the issues are throughout the regulatory process, don't really rely on Congress to change law. It's very difficult to do so, but to help think creatively and recognize that at the end of the day, all permitting is local. You need a robust stakeholder group. This is in the U.S. It's all over the world. We work in developing countries. You can't arrive in a developing country and say, this is the way to do things. It has to have local buy-in, local acceptance. It has to become their idea, and you want them to be able to own it going forward. And that is how you actually effectuate change in the private sector, working within the system that we have to date.
So I would just say industry should lead in making AI innovation in the United States inevitable. And it's not right now. And the way that we're going to remain the leaders in AI and innovation is to manage the energy and climate challenges that AI and data centers present by starting from a foundation of this is not going to raise people's power bills. This is not going to pollute local communities. This is going to help the climate, not hurt the climate. And this is going to help good paying jobs and industries grow in the United States. Coming from the foundation of what are the good outcomes that we want, and what are the structures from the public and the private sector that we can create those outcomes to ensure that we still maintain our competitive edge in the United States.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our panelists for joining us.